That's right. There will be an exam given at that time, though, for those of you who are coming to the sessions. So no one has time to grade them, so we may have to skip that. And then on May 14th, Dan Grossman from Environmental Defense Fund, the state director, will be here. So we're back on May 14th. And then, just to make sure that we're all on the same page with this, on the last one in this series, and we will kick in again with more series in the fall, another series in the fall, on May 22nd, we are shifting from Tuesdays to a Wednesday for Dr. Goldstein, our public health person. So we'll do the whole drill with eye contact and nodding on. Okay, good. Okay. And then this Thursday, May 2nd at 6:30 p.m. in Math 100, Governor John Hickenlooper and I will be in a dialogue about fracking and its many dimensions and issues. There is a good chance that that will be crowded, so try to get there early if you're planning to come to that. It will be ticketed. The tickets will be worth $0, except as scalping, maybe as scalping you could get somewhere on that, because it's simply, the ticketing is simply to make sure that we have a limited number of people in the seats and we don't have fire marshal issues. So do get there in time to get a ticket. Oh, 6:30. 6:30 this Thursday.
How do you get the tickets?
How do you get the tickets? You suck up to me. No. No, that is not how you get the tickets.
And is there a secondary market?
Yeah, that's right. The economists will help us understand these tickets as we go along through the evening. I believe that when you come in the door at the math building, and the math building is between engineering and Benson Earth Sciences, if that helps there, and just be walking past the stadium and then you'll heading towards engineering, and you're very close then. Okay, so when you come in the door, you will get a ticket, and then we will stop giving tickets when we cannot give any more tickets, which will be a disappointing thing for those. That will be a sad situation. So try to get there early, and 6:30 is again when it starts, and probably 6 or so to, I guess that's right, to make sure you get in there. Okay, tonight we have the department chair of economics, and a person that, I don't know if it's appropriate to fill department chair envy, but to have Nick Flores as my department chair, I think would be a very nice situation. He's smart, he's kind, he's direct, he's clear. He would not lead you on if you were going someplace in a direction that wasn't worth going to, but he would be forthright and supportive and of the things that were worthwhile. This is just something I've always thought, that if you want to come be the department chair of the Senate of the American West, I think that would be something we could talk about. But he is I guess what I'm trying to say here is a very good citizen of the university, as well as an important figure in his field. His research interests include decision-making and the environment in terms of public goods, environmental and public goods valuation, and research methodology in environmental economics. He received his degrees from the University of California, San Diego. He has been in Boulder since 1995. But what a presence you've been. I would have given it 5 more years than that. So I was fortunate to meet him early. He is a faculty affiliate of the Senate of the American West. I actually think if we had a little crown or something we could give you that would be for the most underutilized faculty affiliate of the Senate of the American West. We have been respectful of your time. You're a very busy person, but I think we're going to put that behind us and utilize you a lot more. So I'm really pleased to be using these terribly dehumanizing words of commercialization here. I am now very happy tonight to be utilizing Nick Flores and his expertise in this talk, and there he is. I do need to just say we'll follow the usual drill. In about 30 minutes, Senate of the American West people will come around and collect questions, and I'll do my usual frenetic sorting here, and then I'll pass on the questions to Professor Flores. Excuse me.
Thank you, Patty. What she really means is that I just haven't done anything for the Center for the American West, and that was just a polite way to call me out in public. So I appreciate you coming out to hear about economics, which a lot of people think is really boring, and economists are no fun. And a lot of economists are not fun. But I wish this had been on a Friday, right? So it'd be Fracking Friday. But I think you should have a Fracking Friday party. So before I begin, I want to talk a little bit about myself. I have Patty was saying how short my bio was, and I said some people live and die by their bio, but I don't. But I just want to tell you a little bit about myself, and that will give you some context of where I'm coming from on this issue. Okay, so I got these degrees from the University of California, San Diego, and I do a lot. My scholarly research involves environmental decision making and a lot of work in benefit cost analysis. But my worldview on this was formed, and I can back up to about 1977. When I worked as a merchant seaman in the oil patch, and so for 2.5 years, I didn't go to college until I was 27. And so my early years, some of my time was spent in the Gulf of Mexico working on an oil supply boat in the Gulf of Mexico, and that was a great experience. I loved working on the water, and I met a lot of really interesting people with interesting names like Boudreaux, and I worked with a lot of Cajuns. It was a good experience, but I got to see a lot of the oil industry. And so I know the oil industry from the inside because, every 2 out of every 3 weeks I was out working a supply boat, taking stuff out to drilling platforms and also just regular rigs in the Gulf of Mexico. And that was a great experience. One of the things that struck me about that is I appreciated how things can go wrong. So several times I went out to blowouts where there were not fires but blown out rigs in the Gulf of Mexico, either spraying off venting natural gas or oil spill. And also I saw people remember when when people couldn't be airlifted out, when they get injured on rigs, when they couldn't get airlifted out because of weather, sometimes they'd be on our boat and people get really injured working in that industry. And so the real lesson I got from that is mistakes happen and things happen just in routine affairs, and I really grew to appreciate that. And so there's a lot of things that can go wrong, and as Deepwater Horizon pointed out to us, even the most careful planning can end up in accident and disaster. Next piece, so if I fast forward to 1990, I started grad school, and that was just 6 or 7 months after the Exxon Valdez oil spill. And so when I was a grad student, I worked summers at a firm called Natural Resource Damage Assessment Incorporated, working on the Exxon Valdez spill, the assessment for the state of Alaska is who we were working for. And so I have experience there, and then the next case we worked on was a PCB and DDT contamination case in the Channel Islands. And so my economics, early in my economics career, was looking at accidents and the economics of accidents. And so I come into this topic, I'm not an expert on fracking, but I come into this topic with kind of knowledge and firsthand experience with accidents in the industry. And so with that backdrop, I guess in a lot of ways I'm probably like many of you. Right? So fracking is a revolution, right? And I guess it's really, we should say shale gas is a revolution. I mean, it's really transformed energy in America. And I'm going to give you some more evidence towards the end of the talk. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Okay, ExxonMobil has staked everything on shale gas. Okay, that is their future, and it's really a big thing in a revolution that's happening. Whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, kind of depends on your perspective. But it's really taken off. It's transformed energy in the United States, and so. It's a big issue. Having worked on and seen what can go wrong, I can see there's a lot of public reluctance on the part of this. And I think there's a case to be made and a lot of regulation to be put in place, and so there's a lot of catching up to do. Okay, so with that in mind, I'll give you some observations. And here's a little overview of the talk. It's kind of divided into 4 pieces. So. I told a friend of mine that I was going to give this talk, who's is a fellow at Resources for the Future, and he said, "Oh, you need to read our new work on Pathways to Dialogue." And so I'm going to give you some evidence from that report. This is a study done by Resources for the Future. I'm just going to provide an overview of that, and it kind of gets at this issue of real or hype, because there are a lot of people in the industry who are saying, "Oh no, these methods, if done properly, everything is fine." But then there are other people who have a lot of concern, and so Resources for the Future did a study to look at, focused on experts, right, in the industry and in NGOs, and I'll provide some overview of that. Then I'm going to look at the problem of externalities. So economists are really worried about that. So a lot of people think that economists are just all about markets, but we study the lack of markets a lot, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem of externalities with regard to shale gas and the production of shale gas. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about property rights and groundwater contamination. Right? So this actually turns out, from an accident standpoint, this is the thing I think people fear the most, and I think experts fear this the most too. If we think about when we're doing vertical drilling and going down through people's water supplies in groundwater, there's a lot that can go wrong there, right? And if, accidents that occur, we can have large-scale groundwater contamination. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem of addressing that, and the institutional structure for addressing that, and how I think it's really quite lacking and doesn't really protect the public. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about market benefits from natural gas production. And this is going to be in response to a question that Patty asked me. So we were sitting in the UMC, and this is how I got invited to talk. I was eating lunch in the UMC, and I walked by Patty, and she's sitting at the table, and I sat down with her, and she told me that she had a big grant to look at fracking. And we just started talking about it, and she raised the question. She said, well, when I talk to people in the industry, particularly small producers, they're losing their shirts. Why do they keep producing all this natural gas when the price is going through the floor and a lot of small... So I have a take on that. So the last piece is dedicated to Professor Limerick. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about this study. So this is a study produced by Resources for the Future. For those of you who don't know what Resources for the Future is, it's a nonprofit think tank. Focuses mostly on resource and environmental issues. If you don't know, most economists are pretty middle of the road. So the way we're trained is to be fairly agnostic. We rely more on evidence, even though, like any group, we all have our political predispositions and our life values that we bring into the discipline with us. But our training is such that I think that we come at things from a fairly neutral standpoint, and Resources to the Future is very much like that. It has a long history of studying resource issues and provides credible evidence. It's almost all economists there. They're starting to have more people in political science and sociology, but for the most part, it's a shop of very reputable economists. So I'm going to talk about the study that they did. The basis of their study is they surveyed experts in shale gas. Okay, so these people were people who came from NGOs, academia, industry, and government, and some people were lawyers, right? Some people were lawyers, some people were activists, but there are people that they identified as knowledgeable experts. I haven't read the report that carefully, but they managed to bring in 215 people to participate in their survey. What did they ask people to do? One of the things they asked them to do is kind of identify these routine risks. Okay, to identify routine risks, they had a matrix that they had industry and NGO people help them develop to where they had these different pathways of risk in ordinary operations for shale gas, from siting to drilling to development to disposing of waste and stuff. And so one task was they picked these different things that they thought were problematic in the sense that the regulations and practices are not adequate. Okay, so different groups got to answer this. And then they also identified priorities for reducing potential accidents. So these would be things like, if you think about the examples I was giving you with regard to development of oil and gas in the Gulf of Mexico, there are leakages that occur that put stuff in the water, and then there are oil spills from rig blowouts and tankers running aground and things like that. So this would fall into that later, where we're looking at accidents. Okay, and then they ask questions about who should have the primary regulatory authority and how would that work out best. So the way that they analyzed the data was they looked at the intersection. So they basically took each group's top 20. Like they looked at the top 20 responses from each group. So those were within a group. Those were the particular risk pathways that were identified. And there was no ranking among these, by the way. I think it would have been better, but it would have been an impossible task. But there was no rank given to these. So they looked at this matrix, and you could go in, and they have. If you look at their report on the web, they have screens where you go in, and it has different pathways, like setting up the rig and setting up the site. And then within that, they had these risk pathways, and people could check off. Basically, they just check a box and say, okay, I think that's a problem that we're not adequately dealing with. And so then they looked at the intersection of these sets. Okay, and so the report mostly focuses on this 12 in the middle there. Yeah. So those are the issues that were identified by each group. So they came up in the top 20 of each group. And then you can see as we move out, there are some things that 3 groups identified in the top 20, but 1 group did not, and so on. Okay. So what did they come up with? So, I'm sorry, well, I guess you can see that okay. So you can see from the activities, they have site preparation, drilling, fracturing, and completion, which is all part of drilling, and it's also part of the operation and the extraction process. And then storage, removal, disposal of fracking fluids, and backflow. Okay, so you can see the pathways there and the things that happen on the impacts. Okay, so the impacts turn to be important from an institutional standpoint in the way that those things are regulated. Right. So if you look at site preparation, you can see that it causes habitat disruption. And also it has impacts from runoff off of the site. So you go out and disturb the soil, rains hard, runs into the water, affects surface water. Similarly, drilling, air quality, there's methane venting when wells are drilled, and then there's methane venting that occurs after when you're producing. So you can look down and see the different things that they identified. So now these are things, you have to remember the form of the question, right? These are things that these groups are identifying as they have inadequate regulation or practice, right, to protect the public and the environment. Okay, so these are things that everybody in the group says we don't have the particular regulation or practice in place for this not to be a problem. Okay. So there are some things, it's interesting if you look at things that were uniquely identified in these top 20 groups. Industry respondents kind of focused on traffic and congestion, right? Traffic and congestion. The interesting thing, I was looking through the report, didn't talk much about, I spoke at a symposium at Ohio Wesleyan University in February, and one of the people on the panel with me was the Ohio EPA Director of Surface Water. And one of the things that he was concerned with is a lot of the water, so one of these drilling operations uses on average 5 million gallons of water. Okay, and so when they inject that into the well, right, they lose about 40% of it. So then they recycle that, and it turns out the more they recycle it, it becomes very saline. Right, it's one of the problems with it, and that's why you can't dispose of it in surface water, because when they're finished with it, when it gets to where it's not usable any longer, it has this high saline content. If that gets in the river, it kills everything in the river. So there was a guy in February who had a company that would take fluids and inject it in Ohio waters, and he told his guys to go on out there and just dump it in the river, and there was a big kill in the river. Ohio EPA didn't know what happened, and then some of the employees turned the guy in, and he was arrested. Right, so it was a criminal offense. But when they ship this around, there's a potential for an accident, and I didn't know this was coming up. NGO respondents, interestingly, identified pathways that were associated with conventional air pollutants. Government respondents focused more on the unique things they identified were things involving groundwater. So just out of curiosity, how many of you are most worried about groundwater when you think about this issue? Raise your hand. So not that many. To me, when I look at it, I just look at just the basic physics of the operation, right? The basic physics of the operation. You sink a well down for, a lot of these are up to a mile, right, in the vertical drill. And you're going through groundwater, it just seems to me like the propensity for accident in groundwater is something that when I first started learning about this, I thought, well, that looks like something that could really be a problem. Anyway, so moving on. Academic respondents, they looked at two different things they identified uniquely. One was the impact of industrial development on communities, and the other one was the risk of surface water diversion on groundwater. Right, so from pumping off water, diverting from water, and then its impact on groundwater. So the other things that came in those that fell into those yellow and blue intersections were so everybody but industry looked at identified this impact of surface water from using wastewater for de-icing. Okay, and I think the problem is and I don't mention it in the talk, but you can look both on the EPA website and it mentioned in this report, people are worried, so there are radioactive compounds that come up as part of the backflow, and there are also fracking fluids, right? The chemicals that are put in to make things flow better. And so when you look at the end product of this water, it is very saline, and it's probably good for de-icing, but it has the potential to pollute. Also, impact on on groundwater from hydraulic fracturing fluid from flowback. That was the thing that strikes me. And then, interestingly, industry and academic respondents were the only ones that identified seismic vibrations, which is something that's getting a lot of press, but it didn't resonate with those other groups. Okay. So respondents were asked to identify what they consider high priority risks, right? High priority risks. And I think in this one they were asked to identify, this one, what are your top three? And in the top three, all identified cement failure and casing failure. So this would be the big straw that's going down has some sort of a problem with it. And obviously, lots of things can go wrong there, but the main one being contamination of groundwater. So that's what, the integrity of the casing and the cement protects groundwater. And then, for the other two industry experts, again, it's interesting that they were focused on accidents again, right here. But maybe that's to do with people being used to being out on the job, because probably the frequency of accidents occurs, the biggest risk for the development of a nuclear plant, right? The greatest loss of life for the lifetime of a nuclear plant is its construction, right? And similarly, when you're moving trucks around, people get hurt all the time. And so maybe that's why industry focused on that. The other three groups, though, focused on failure of impoundment, right? And at mining sites, we have a lot of experience with that, right? So impoundment sites at a lot of mines in the United States are regularly inundated by high flows from snowfall and stuff like that. So it's natural that they would think about that. Mitigation authority. As you might expect, industry experts favored industry dealing with mitigation problems more than government, but it was overwhelmingly with academic and NGO experts that government was the proper mitigation risk authority. It was split in two parts. When it became a shared authority issue, when that was an option, everyone really liked that. Right? All groups favored that, and that was the most frequently chosen when that was an option. So let me talk briefly now. I'm going to switch over into talking about more economic issues. So in summary on what I just went through, to me, looking at their report convinces me that it's not hype. right? So there's a lot of, I don't know if it's misinformation. It's funny reading some of the other stuff that RFF has on their website. I was struck by the tone of some of it. It had a certain ring to it, like, oh, there's all this hype going on there, and it was almost as if, and I know these guys pretty well. There was a little bit of a gotcha whenever they made a point where there's no evidence for this, but I think that their study demonstrates that a lot of people in the know think that there are some pretty significant problems associated with this practice. But we got to think about this in the bigger context. There's a lot of things that go on in industry that also impose environmental risks, right? The manufacturing of just about anything you can name has a lot of these same problems associated with it, right? And so just because there are environmental problems associated with this industry, there are environmental problems associated with any industry because we can't produce stuff without making waste. So that's some of the reality. So I kind of want to, I want to put this in that context. Economists, we think a lot about that, right? We think a lot about, if you want to have stuff, you're going to have waste, right? You're going to have waste, and so it's kind of finding that balance. So the pathways study kind of suggests these two classes of externalities. One class from these routine risks, and then from these high priority accidents. So I'm going to want you to think with me a little bit about these particular issues and the way that they're regulated. Okay. So for routine risks, right? So for routine risks, how do economists view this problem? The thing that we focus on so when you have externalities occurring, right, that turns out to be a market inefficiency. So if you look at, what's the economist's answer to CO2 emissions is to incorporate that, to make people pay for the damage that they're doing. That's the basis of a carbon tax or a cap and trade system that raises the cost of things, that the carbon content of goods. So it's basically to internalize some of that externality. And so those are the basic economic principles. Something that's really important in looking at this is we want things to occur on the margin, right? So if firms have to pay, right, we want them to pay for the damages that they're causing, but we want it to be associated directly with the level of emissions that are occurring. Right? So that gives firms the right incentives to try to curtail their emissions, right? To curtail their emissions or to face charges, right? And so that's why we like that so much. I just said it all. Okay, so let's think about air quality. Okay, so one of the things that I've discovered when looking through and reading through the literature in the past couple of months is there's a lot of disagreement over the degree of the problem of methane emissions. Right, so it's fairly mixed. When I think when they go out and study, I guess there was a recent study here near Erie where Ceres that set those towers up, or NOAA, I can't remember who it was. Maybe Patty could help me.
Possibly.
NOAA, okay, NOAA. And they set up air quality monitoring out in areas with a lot of drilling, but they weren't able to uniquely identify emissions. If I remember the article in the paper, they weren't able to uniquely identify emissions that were associated with local drilling, but they were certainly picking up a lot of air quality problems. And I don't know how much of that was associated with methane, but my read of the literature is right now there's scientific disagreement, and so we need some more information about that. So air quality regulation to date does not regulate greenhouse gases in any meaningful way. So we don't have rules for greenhouse gas emissions. I think the administration is moving that way. The EPA has the authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, but to date we're not really doing that. And so these are things that are just going to fall under the regulatory radar screen for any form of control. Economists typically like to point out the inefficiency of technology standards as opposed to emissions charges for pollution. I'm not as dogmatic, but I think a lot of the evidence suggests that the way that we regulate emissions, particularly air quality emissions, turns out to be pretty inefficient in the sense that the Clean Air Act, basically stipulates control standards for different industry classes. A lot of times they're based on, some of it is based on cost, not always, but basically it's the same standard for the entire industry. And a lot of that has to do with, we don't want to put firms out of business in one place, even though the air quality is not very bad, and they really wouldn't need to spend as much. But at the same time, that's basically a political solution. The thing that we don't like, economists don't like about technology standards, it strips away it takes away incentives to innovate, and that turns out to be inefficient from that sense. So takeaway points with regard to air quality is we're pretty inefficient in the way we regulate air quality. What's going to happen with stuff from shale gas operations, so emissions from shale gas operations, is it's going to impose a cost on people. When areas go out of attainment, the cost of coming into attainment is going to be borne not just by the shale gas industry, but it's going to be borne by dry cleaners and everybody else. And so there's a real cost that's coming, that's implied from shale gas operations. I guess I should. How long should I go? About 45 minutes or so?
You've got another 20.
Okay, well then I better hurry. Okay, surface water quality. I'm not a real fan of the Clean Water Act. Okay, so the Clean Water Act, even though it's done a lot of good, water in the United States since the passage of the Clean Water Act has improved dramatically, but it's only gone so far. And a lot of the problem is that the Clean Water Act, operates on a partnership between states and the feds, and they come up with designated water body uses, and then they find out what are the level of emissions that water body can take, and then they generate again standard-based technologies. Right? If you look around the country, basically what happens is there are fines associated with violations of the Clean Water Act that are usually borne by states and municipalities and counties. And my take of it is that fines are mostly avoided by spending money. It doesn't matter if you bring the water body into compliance, as long as you spend money, and a lot less than the money you would have to spend on fines, you're off the hook. So what's the track record? I looked at the summary of assessed waters, and you can see it's not a very good track record. 53% of streams and rivers are impaired. 67% of lakes are impaired. And I'm just looking at freshwater bodies. 99% of the Great Lakes are impaired. So in that sense, for most of the streams and lakes in the United States, the Clean Water Act is falling very short of its goal. So what we expect? Well, if we're not doing a good job in the first place, fracking is not going to be able to handle that very well either. Okay. Now that's looking at. Oh yes. So talk a little bit about groundwater. So there are these different areas. The one I want to focus on is the underground injection control program. Okay. So in order to sink injection wells, both for fracking operations when you sink a well and for disposal, I think they're class 2 permits, right? Class 2 permits. Statistics on this is there are 17,000 of them in the United States, and we're just getting started. Right? And we're just getting started. So this is going to be a big deal, right? It's going to be a lot more. There are going to be a lot more wells drilled, and so we're going to have a lot of this going on. From a regulatory standpoint, there is the authority to do this, right? There is the authority to do this, but mostly the regulation right now is on standards for the wells, and we don't have a lot of experience yet with real problems. Okay, high priority accidents. Okay, so what do we want? What do we expect of firms for accidents? Right? I'm really familiar with oil spills. So the thing we would like to see firms doing, if we impose strict liability on them, right, and that's what we'd want. We don't want to be subsidizing industry, right, because if we subsidize industry in the sense of if there's a spill or an accident, right, there's a casing accident, and the government comes in and picks it up, then that's not going to give firms the incentive to exercise the right amount of precaution, right? So the economic idea behind it, and the ideal is that marginal expenditures on precaution, right, reduce the risk and reduce the expected marginal costs from accidents exactly, right, exactly, and that's what we're striving for. One of the things that you probably saw got a lot of press with the Deepwater Horizon spill was the Oil Pollution Act has a cap on damages, on economic damages, a total cap on economic damages, unless there is gross negligence, and I believe the courts found gross negligence for that. Otherwise, there would have been a cap in place. I think it was $70 million. BP is going to be is already on the hook for billions of dollars. So there's an example that we want from a system. We want firms to be liable for their damages that they inflict on others, and then that will provide the proper incentives. Okay. So in that, I want to talk about groundwater, because I've thought about this a little bit, because that's the problem that I identified, and so I wanted, I thought more about that. So as the pathways study suggests, in terms of accidents, everybody's thinking about this. Right, this is the big thing, and it's cement failure and drill casing failure, and a lot of that is because we could. I was thinking about. I grew up in San Antonio, and the Edwards Aquifer supplies water to many people, right? And it's a fairly integrated aquifer system. And I thought, what if you contaminated the Edwards Aquifer? You'd be up the stream without a paddle, right? And so. The potential for it, and I think this is why all the groups are focused on it, the potential damage could be great. Right? The potential damage would be great. If you look across the landscape, there are a lot of places that rely on surface waters, but there are a lot of communities, particularly small communities, that are really relying on groundwater, so this could be a problem. So some colleagues at Duke University did a property value study. Okay, this is a National Bureau of Economic Research working paper. All that means is the NBER fellows are, it's very hard to get in. They're distinguished researchers. Basically what they looked at was what happens to property values near drilling sites and not near drilling sites. And so they used different statistical methods to control for this. And the thing they come up with is that properties close to drilling sites, actually when they're not on groundwater, it showed an increase in property values, and that probably has to do with economic activity in the area. But when they look at folks who are on groundwater, there's a significant decrease in property values. Now, is that real or not? Well, it's certainly a matter of perception, right? So people are thinking about this, and the market's reflecting it, right? So whether it's a real problem or not, it's definitely one that's bearing out in the marketplace according to this study. Okay, so groundwater. Okay, so groundwater, I've just listed different property rights regimes. One of the things that for the most part, groundwater runs by the rule of capture, right, or some variant of it. There are some states. Some states regulate when you impinge on others. So you drill your well and you disrupt somebody next to you. Some states protect for that, some do not. Texas is absolute dominion, right? In fact, the Texas Supreme Court recently ruled that they can't even have conservation districts down there. So it is pure rule of capture. And it was over the Edwards Aquifer. They were trying to do some regulation on the Edwards Aquifer so they could manage as a joint system and think about restricting withdrawals, and this Texas Supreme Court threw it out. The point I want to make, though, about property rights regimes is they're almost all about quantity. Okay, so they're almost all about quantity because that's what they've had to deal with so far, right? So they're geared to address quantity issues and not much to do with contamination. So where does that leave us? Okay. So there are a number of fracking cases where there's groundwater contamination or purported groundwater contamination in the United States now. And I was reading some law review magazines and some stuff by a bunch of Houston lawyers, and it's really hard to prove groundwater contamination. So if you think about it, the redress you have if you've got a well on your property is set, I know many of you have probably seen the stories on the news where they're turn on the faucet and light the water on fire, right? And so there's methane in the water, right? There is at least anecdotal evidence where people think that their wells have been contaminated by methane, right? And they're near these drilling operations. It's difficult to prove, to establish groundwater contamination, right? And the reason it's really difficult to prove is because of the following. Most of the time you don't have baseline, this is by some people at Resources for the Future. If you don't have baseline information, you don't have a case, right? And it goes a little beyond that. So the groundwater contamination, so there are industry groundwater contamination cases that a lot of times their expert witness testimony is thrown out, right? And it's either because of lack of baseline information or a lack of predictive validity for their models, right? And so you need, the standard is really high to prove groundwater contamination cases, and that's a real problem, okay? Because that leaves people fairly naked to groundwater contamination. So if you're in an area, and say my brother-in-law lives in North Texas, and there's a lot of shale gas development around him, and he lives on a well, right? His neighbors, it's funny, everyone there is very conservative, and they hate the idea of shale gas development. They're really afraid of it, because they're afraid their wells are going to be contaminated. So how can we improve? Let's see. I think this is mostly how can we improve the efficiency of this? Okay, so I think this is a really important point. So you need to have baseline information. I was talking to my brother-in-law. I said, the people in your area should start monitoring your wells. Otherwise, you're just not going to have a leg to stand on. Right? You're going to be chucking in water to your place and bearing that expense. And it's pretty expensive to get water trucked in just about anywhere. So what are ways we can look at this is, one thing, we need third-party monitoring that's peer-reviewed. Okay, so if you think about it, this isn't just I think about, I've lived along the coast a lot. This isn't, you get your little water sampling kit. You've got to go out and get water quality, well sampling that's credible, that can stand up in court. And I think that people who own wells, this is their protection, right? Is to have scientifically credible information before drilling occurs, right? Before drilling occurs, or at least to establish that you had a good well at some point. And it's pretty important. This model calibration and testing is to have a model for what's going on with groundwater in the area. Right? So these are the standards that have to occur. These are things that the state can provide. Right? These are things that the state can provide. And how would you fund it? To me, you're coming in. You've got shale development operations coming in. You can have a groundwater monitoring program that's funded by industry. Right? It's a kind of a condition for you coming into the area, is that you have to pay for this. There's one developer in Ohio that actually, for liability reasons, is doing this in advance. They're coming in and they're sinking test wells, and they're doing all of this stuff because they want to be able to find out what's the impact, and they want to be able to limit their liability. Okay, they want to be able to limit their liability, but that's kind of it's not a no-brainer, but it's a defensive mechanism, right, for addressing the problem, and I think it's really important. Okay, so summary points. So there's a lot of, the reason that many of you are interested in this topic is because there are a lot of environmental issues associated with this. I didn't see the movie with Matt Damon. I wanted to see it, but the stuff can definitely go wrong, and it is going to go wrong. I think there are going to be some, just like Deepwater Horizon. Right? Just like Deepwater Horizon, there are going to be some massive accidents that occur with this. The degree of what's going on in shale gas, it's just going to happen. Right? It's going to happen, and there's no avoiding it. We'd like to have a regulatory structure and a legal structure for redressing damage in place that kind of fits the problem and isn't so costly. right? So when everything has to be settled in court, it gets really costly to do that. And most ordinary people won't be able to do that. So they're really then left just vulnerable to, whatever happens. And that's not efficient. That's not efficient. Okay. Now I'm going to talk about some natural gas market facts. Okay, and so this is kind of some of the basic economics of it. So the interesting thing about shale gas boom is it was unrecognized, 8 years ago, right? So the Energy Information Agency reports it hardly mentions shale gas development, right? Hardly mentions it. So in a sense, a lot of people missed the boat. Right? A lot of people missed the boat in predicting what was going to happen. We have right now in the United States, we have a lot more capacity for importing liquid natural gas than exporting liquid natural gas because a bunch of companies invested thinking we were going to be a net. We actually, let's see, I can't remember if we're a net importer, but we are not importing much liquid natural gas. But the money a few years ago was we were going to be importing a lot of it, right? Because we were going to have shortages, so we kind of missed it. So there's a statistic show, this is from the energy information industry, 50% of the natural gas market now is from shale gas, 70% in 2035. Okay, so that's a big deal. So, in reading about this, it's not about fracturing, right, which is a method that's been around since the late 40s, I believe. It's these other advances that have all come together at once, right? So advances in vertical drilling, the ability to see stuff down the hole, and horizontal drilling, right? So those are the real innovations, and those things coming together have created the shale gas revolution. And as I said, for better or for worse, it's transformed U.S. energy in a major way. Okay. So what's happened to the price of natural gas? So this is per 1,000 cubic feet. We can see that, post 2004, prices spiked over, $10 per 1,000 cubic feet. Right now, the latest statistic for January of 2012, for December of 2012 was approximately $3.50 for 1,000 cubic feet of natural gas. So that's, I guess, it's whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I guess it depends on how you look at it. And I just want to point out, so there are kind of two views on this. Okay, so one thing, and I think a lot about climate change. Right? I think a lot about climate change. So natural gas produces a lot less CO2 emissions, approximately 50% less. The boom that's occurred is the price of natural gas is cheap enough now where it's majorly displacing coal and electricity generation, right? And so our emissions are going down, right? Our emissions are going down, even though our electricity consumption is going up. So energy consumption is going up, but our emissions are going down because of natural gas boom, right? A lot of people, and our president is a real believer that, the prosperity of the country depends upon abundant and cheap energy. Right? It's very clear in his policies that when he came into office, he's as friendly as George Bush was with regard to, development in the United States. And so, probably if we crank down enough on energy, it's gonna hurt the economy. So those are the good sides of it. But like I said, it depends on your perspective. A lot of people don't like the shale gas boom and cheap natural gas prices because they think that it hinders the development onto what some people feel is the ultimate path, which is renewable energy. Right? So, as an economist, I can use both hands. Right? I can use both hands. So it really is a matter of perspective. Right? It really is a matter of perspective, and that's the thing. So the economic approach to stuff is to compare alternative states of the world. Right? Is to compare alternative states of the world, and it depends on what your alternative is, right? It depends on what your alternative is. If we're looking at, compared to coal, life is going to be a lot better, I think, with natural gas. Right? I think from the environmental impact. But then there's all this stuff going on. Oh yeah, one of the things that I want to touch on, and you all are aware of this, but one of the things why this is so important and such a hot button issue is because, I grew up in Texas. all the drilling went out in the Gulf and in West Texas, and it came at a time when it started out when no one was there. No one is there now, right, except the people who work in the oil patch. In contrast, we're drilling now. I remember a vivid memory of the picture in the Daily Camera of some poor guy out in Erie in a subdivision, and 50 feet over there is a drilling rig from his bedroom, right? So what's happening now is we're going back into areas that are already developed, full of people, and we're doing some major exploration and drilling, and that makes it really different, right? That really makes it different. It makes the impact different. Okay. So let's talk about, and this is my response to Patty. Okay, this is my response to Patty. So the future looks bright. Recently, the price of natural gas at the wellhead is $3.35 per 1,000 cubic feet. Let's contrast that to Japan. Okay, so Japan exports is not a gas producer at all, and their demand is going to go way up, right? And their demand is going to go way up because they're going to get off of their primarily nuclear generation of their electricity, and they've forsaken that. Right? So they're going to be going to natural gas. They're going to be big importers. So these are landed prices for liquid and natural gas. As you can see, it's a lot more expensive. So if you look down, I've got these estimates of conversion, shipping, and then regasification. So add $2.15. That's the price of natural gas in Japan. So $19 per 1,000 cubic feet. The terminals in Europe, mostly around $9, so $11 per 1,000 cubic feet. Okay, so there are definitely some gains from trade. Right? If you're a natural gas developer here in the United States, you'd like to get in that market. You'd like to get in that market. So just think about, if I could ship liquid natural gas, I don't want to sell it to you for $3.35. Right? When I can sell it to Japan for $17. Okay. So my colleague Paul Joskow, who's a professor at MIT, recently wrote a paper, and he really plays that down. He's like, liquid natural gas, it's really expensive. That's people are crying about that. It's not going to be a big deal. Okay. So I looked up some things over the last few days. So it's interesting. There was an article I read about, so Exxon, obviously, producers want to export. They want to get that gap, right? They want to get that gap. A lot of industry does not. In fact, there was an article I read was saying that Dow Chemical is now at odds. So they're usually very cozy in their, they're very united with ExxonMobil, but they are really opposed to big exports of liquid natural gas because they know it's going to raise the price of natural gas in the United States. And that means it's going to directly impact their costs because they're huge energy users in feedstock and their whole cycle. They're very energy dependent. Okay, so we don't do much exporting of liquid natural gas at the moment. So 1.6 trillion cubic feet in 2012. I looked online and there are applications for 17 facilities, right? And so that what they have to get approval of is their facility will allow them to export natural gas to I'm drawing a blank now. Our people within our trade organization and people outside. So the total application is for 21.3. The capacity would be for 21 trillion cubic feet per year. Okay, so that's what's in place. That's the kind of capacity that their application's in place for. I'm talking to Joskow's point that this isn't a big deal. So total natural gas production in 2012 was 24 trillion cubic feet. So there's some plans from producers to move a lot of natural gas out of this country. So then we think about the market impact of that. Okay, as soon as we direct a direct liquid natural gas pipeline with any capacity, the price of natural gas in the United States is going to be the world price of natural gas in the United States. It's not going to be the one we're seeing now. Right? So it's only natural that the cheap prices are not going to be forever. And that's why everyone is developing. Even though the price of gas is low right now, the plans are we're going to be once again, the king of supplying, it's going to be 1917 again or whatever, and we're going to be supplying the world with energy, is the plan. So that's what we have to look forward to. right? I mean, I guess the trade deficit will improve dramatically. Trade deficit will improve dramatically, but when we look at what's going on, the benefits of shale gas production, and there are obviously the environmental problems associated with it, but I think cheap natural gas, it's not going to be as cheap as it is now, and we can't think of it in that sense. Right? We can't think of it in that sense because it's a world market. Maybe we can, convince Congress to limit exports, but I kind of doubt it. Okay, so those are my observations on this problem. Thanks. I wasn't. Patty was saying that I was disappointed that nobody came to protest.
Well, consider joining us on Thursday night. But you were interested.
Okay.
Though that might not be the case. Okay, so I just a couple of questions about. I'll be sort of moving across this way from different topic areas, and I want to start with a few little details. Well, it's not a little one, but please clarify the meaning of paying for emissions at the margin and how that differs from other ways of determining payment required.
Okay, so what that means is that we monitor emissions, right? We monitor emissions, and for every unit of emissions, you face a price for that unit, right? So you face a price for that unit. And so basically is that the more you emit, the more you pay. The less you emit, the less you pay. Right? And so that's the basic idea behind it. So that's paying at the margin, meaning that whatever place you're moving on, your bill adjusts accordingly. Okay.
Okay.
Does that make sense? And so the basic idea is similar. If you put a tax, right? If you put a tax on emissions, and it's cheaper to one thing you can do if it's really expensive to cut back emissions, you just pay the tax. Right? But if it's cheaper to reduce emissions, well, then you'll take that into account, and that's the idea. That's why we like it.
Okay.
That approach.
These are kind of ones, couldn't quite categorize them in the others here, but okay, this would be a question of debit and credit for methane combustion. For every 1 BCF of natural gas that is combusted, nearly 11 million gallons of water is created. If a carbon tax is needed for CO2 that is also created by combustion, should there be a credit for water added?
Let's see.
Okay, so you are going to create water and CO2, and should there be, if you're going to get penalized for creating the carbon, should you get some kind of benefit from creating the water?
I don't really understand the question. So who's the questioner?
Well, I think I understand the question.
Okay.
It's just that, so you burn your methane.
Okay.
And one product of that is CO2, which you'd be penalized with a carbon tax. And the other product would be H2O, which is good news. We like water. It's not snowing tonight, but we like water. So if you're going to penalize the carbon production, should you reward the water production?
So we don't, is this still on?
I think so.
So we don't, yeah, it's not on.
It didn't, we seem to have.
It clicked off. Wait a minute.
No.
Maybe it has an automatic. If you drone, if you drone on long enough, it cuts you off.
Has that happened to you? Okay, so I'll just develop.
Okay, so let me, here's my take on the question. So currently, water is free in the United States.
You might hold a little bit closer.
The thing that, if you look at water markets, what you pay for in water is the delivery of water. For the most, even though we have water markets in the West, for the most part, it's free. Right? But you go to Ohio, it's no charge for water. Right? You don't have to own water. It rains down from heaven. Given there's a lack of market in most places for it now, I'd say that it doesn't make sense to credit with water.
Okay. Now I'm going to your home. Oh no, I'll just bellow. And I'm not I'm not part of the filming. So, okay. So now we are going to a county, the county between Dallas and Fort Worth, and I can't totally read the word there. But it seems to be, well, it doesn't matter. The county.
It's maybe Tarrant.
Yes.
Tarrant.
Yes, it is. It was either that or a tourist county,
Texas,
which didn't make any sense. So okay, it's Tarrant County. The Barnett Shale is drilled intensively in that area, in that county. What is the status of air emissions there? And is there a cultural difference between Texas and Colorado on all of these issues of contamination and how to gauge them and how to be alarmed, at what level to be alarmed about them?
So one of the things that I want to remind you is that I am not an expert on this. Are there differences? I'll just speak to the question. Are there differences between Fort Worth and Colorado? I think if we look at what's going on in the two areas, they're really similar. I would say that it doesn't appear they're really that much different. If we went to Tarrant County and we looked, there are probably people that turn out that are very upset about what's going on, and just like in Colorado. But kind of where the rubber meets the road, there's a lot of shale gas operations going on along the Colorado Front Range, just like there is in Tarrant County. And I'd say that there's no real evidence to suggest that people are really that much different, even though we may like to think of it that way with red and blue states and all that stuff.
Okay, these are questions about the monitoring topic you took up. With so many wells for oil and gas already in place, what hope is there for establishing baseline water quality data that is useful?
So we'd like to have monitoring in place prior to any development, but baseline is a matter of degree, right? So if we go to places where there are already shale gas operations underway, if you have a good well, right, you'd still like to have that information in case something goes wrong down the line. And so I don't think that it's a hopeless case, although it wouldn't protect you if your well has already been contaminated.
Shouldn't the precautionary principle be invoked until proper baseline testing and modeling are conducted? Wouldn't the precaution justify a moratorium until a regime to internalize externalities is implemented?
I agree with that. You know, one of the things in New York, I don't know what the status of it is. I haven't been following this, but New York had a moratorium on shale gas, and I don't know, is that still underway? Yeah, and I just think it makes total sense, right? For a couple of reasons, right? I don't think that the economic benefits associated with it, given the scale of operation in the United States right now, to hold back, the economic costs of it are not that great, and you can wait to see what's going on with the environmental issues. A lot of upstate New York, where that is occurring, is really dependent upon groundwater. And so that, I think that it makes perfect sense to do that. At the same time, you know, a lot of states don't agree with that, and they're moving forward.
Okay. And I may not be totally understanding this one, but monitoring and review would generate economic development, and I'm not totally certain if that means there would be jobs and opportunities and businesses and consultants aplenty and so on, and also data on damage. Should we rely on this fledgling industry to collect water quality data? That is the monitoring business well enough along to be a reliable source of data? This is a market-based approach, but do you think the risks are too high of having monitoring be a business in itself?
Well, I think we'd rather have monitoring occur not by the developers, because the incentives are all wrong. Well, I think that the market would supply, if there was a demand for it, people would step up, and I think that the market could supply this. I mean, who would have ever thought that where we go with tech would, how quickly that's occurred? Or for that matter, think about all the people that are working in the shale gas industry. So if there's the demand for that, if there's the demand for the service will be provided by the market.
Okay, staying with water, and this is on water lost to the hydrological cycle. Fracking, or water lost in fracking, seems to be a type of consumption of water we haven't seen in this quantity. Even water lost to evaporation in Colorado becomes clouds that rain on crops in Ohio. Fracking water is lost forever to the hydrological cycle. Has this new type of water consumption been considered? What economic issues do you think this will cause?
I don't have a clue.
Okay, alrighty then. Moving on here. So you're.
But I will say that if I wanted to answer the question, what I would go and look at, if you look at diversion of water, right? Because there aren't good statistics on consumption of water. So the USGS monitors diversion of water, right? Diversion of water, and it's almost all agriculture. Right? It's such a large portion of it, and electricity generation. Right? Those two are really big. So that, you know, if you wanted to compare it to something, right, you might compare, you know, what's happening with agriculture as opposed to what's happening with shale gas development, and put it in that, you know, kind of in that perspective. 5 million gallons. I don't know my water that much, but I don't know if 5 million gallons is a lot compared to, you know, yeah, well, I don't know. Let's think about a typical, you know, 1,000-acre farm that somebody's operating and using irrigated. So that would, you know, be the context I'd want to place it in.
Right. Your quotation that shale gas produces 50% less greenhouse gases than coal. Did your sources on that look at the entire life cycle, as in cleaning up wastewater, transporting wastewater, capture any releases of methane, etc.?
So I was even-handed, and the coal didn't either, right? You know, that statistic doesn't. Well, a big question mark in shale gas is the methane issue, right? Which is a very powerful greenhouse gas. And so until we get a full accounting of the environmental, or at least the impact on greenhouse gas emissions for shale gas, we really need to understand the methane emissions that are coming from that, from venting, drilling, and production. Okay. So the statistic I quoted was not in that.
Okay.
Not included.
Right, and this is a follow-up question. Same thing. What about the danger of emissions of methane? But you've just spoken on that. The impact of abundant and cheap natural gas on greenhouse global warming, that's the topic. How much additional CO2 gets added to the atmosphere? We're not talking about methane leakage, we're talking about if shale gas is added to other CO2 sources and combusted, and what does that, how does that impact global warming economics? So if we produce it, we don't vent it, but we combust it, what is the role of that in the bigger picture of global warming?
Well, my interpretation of the question is, I think, so it all depends on what the baseline is. Right? So if we're thinking about powering the world on coal, which is, that's the real alternative. Without natural gas, right, if this boom hadn't happened, we'd be turning to coal, right? We'd be turning to coal. But one of the things that's happened with natural gas is inexpensive we're consuming it in much greater quantities. Right? We're consuming it in much greater quantities. This was a record year in both production and consumption of natural gas ever, right? 2012. So cheap natural gas has the impact of, well, energy's cheap, and so we use more of it. Right? So we use more of it. And so on net, I guess that we'd have to consume twice as much energy to have the same greenhouse gas impact, back of the envelope. But again, I mean, there are different paths that we can force ourselves onto besides non-renewables.
And actually, maybe I should have gone over here. Okay, in fact, I'll go to the renewables question. What about the impact of cheap gas on the development of renewables? And you did speak of this.
Quote unquote cheap.
What's that?
Quote unquote cheap. I wrote cheap, but I put quote marks in it.
Oh, cheap. Oh, I see. Quote. Oh, little rabbit ear things. I didn't do the rabbit ear. So that's okay. Good point. Thank you.
Renewables are relatively expensive, right? And cheap natural gas pushes them out of the market, right? It pushes them out of the money. That's just the market reality of it. A carbon tax, right? If we had a carbon tax, that would push some favor towards renewable. And most economists still favor a CO2 tax. Right? Most economists still favor a CO2 tax. Will we ever see it? I don't know. I'm worried that I won't see one in my lifetime. But if you think about the way that we look at energy regulation in the United States, rather than making people pay for their externalities, instead of making you pay for the bad things you do, we pay people to do the right things, right? We provide subsidies to hybrid cars and things like that to try to get them to consume that. I mean, that's really an inefficient way to do that. If we just put a carbon tax on it and made it more expensive to drive, and it affects you on the margin, right? It affects you on the margin, then the logical economic choice is to buy more fuel-efficient cars, and so, or drive less. Right?
So my question was to reduce the subsidies on natural gas production, because there are subsidies now, and there are going to be a lot of problems. And they might not manifest right now, but the costs are going to be huge. So it's falsely cheap. That's why.
Well, I think you're answering,
Right.
Lynn, next time we'll write the questions for you, and we'll just direct them up to you. But if,
Well, I mean, but there is one aspect of it. So without addressing those externalities, right, that all those experts identified, in a sense, that is a subsidy, right? By not incorporating those social costs
Yeah.
into the price of non-renewables.
okay, I'm moving now back to some regulatory questions. What are the economic costs of regulating methane? And I take that to mean what would be the impact on the issues like that support to industry and the value of energy that the president sees for the whole well-being of the country. So what are the economic costs of regulating methane as they might hit the whole economy?
I don't know.
Oh, okay. Economically, how can we best ensure that industry covers externalities that are a direct result of fracking?
I think we need a sea change on the way we think about the problem. The United States, we've been really reluctant to impose costs for pollution. And instead, if you look at the big legislative acts, or the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, and they really rely on technology-based standards, and they're not very effective. And the Clean Water Act is such a blatant example of regulatory scheme that doesn't really work. Right? It doesn't meet its goals. Similarly, for air quality, a lot of areas in the United States are not in compliance. We've achieved a lot, though. I mean, I remember watching Dragnet as a kid, right? And it opened up in Los Angeles, a city of I forgot how many million people. You can't even see, the horizon on it. And through technology-based standards on automobiles, we really changed things a lot. Similarly, for water quality, treatment of sewage really did a lot to clean up our rivers and streams. Right? But there's a lot left to be done, and I just feel like there are a lot of countries that are much more innovative. That are using economic instruments to control pollution, and those turn out to be a lot cheaper. And that's the kind of stuff that economists write about a lot. And if any of you want to come get a PhD in economics in our department, we are accepting applications. You too can think like a genius.
Wow. Remarkable answer. If government, taking off directly from that, if government so far has done a poor job of regulation, why does more government equal a better result?
Better government equals a better result.
You're getting aphoristic here, Nick.
So I'm, openly critical of the regulatory regime. I hope that comes out, and I think that we could do a lot better.
Okay, if all the, sort of still in the regulatory zone here, if all the appropriate regulations were in place to mitigate environmental consequences of natural gas or shale gas production, how much would this affect the price of gas?
I'm guessing fairly significantly.
Yeah. Okay, these are two questions where I might not be doing so great on handwriting on this one. Okay, could you comment on the current level of fines for, what do you mean? Is the level of fines too high or too low? And is that OPG? Oil?
I don't know.
Okay, we might need a little bit of help with some oxygen, the 2 and PG. Can someone?
OPG. Whose question? OPG.
Well, okay.
I don't know.
I don't know.
I haven't studied the the fine structure for the Clean Water or the Clean Air Act.
So the current level of fines
I'll put that right out there. But I know from on violations of the Clean Water Act, the expenditures on restoration and stuff like that to avoid fines is a fraction of the cost of the fines that would be incurred if they just said, oh, we're just going to pay the fine. It would be a lot more than what they pay for restoration.
Okay, this question, I might not be getting this exactly right, but what is the cause of the rise of proximate property values? But you spoke of the sinking of proximate property values.
So my read of the study is that in areas where there's development, incomes go up, right? Incomes go up. Think about, I'll bet you, the price of property values in North Dakota. That's probably a great example. A friend of mine is working up there and he lives in a motel, right? He's a geologist and lives in a motel. Probably to buy a house up there is really expensive, so the property values have gone up, but relative, and that's what their study looked at, relative to similar properties that were dependent on a well, those property values went down.
Okay, talk about the fracking market. How much money is being made and who is making money? Are these markets subsidized? To go back to your Lynn. So, who's making money? How much money is being made? Are these markets subsidized?
I'm not a labor expert on that, but I think that certainly employment in those markets is booming. Is booming.
This might be more about the companies and corporations about who's making money.
I haven't studied their bottom line, but they're doing it, right? And they're rushing to do it, so they're making money. They're making more money than the alternative,
even with the very low prices.
Yeah. This issue though about putting a lot of capacity in place, right? So natural gas. I was talking to one of our we have an economics advisory board for the department. And one of our advisory board members is a guy that works a lot in natural gas dispute, oil and natural gas litigation between producers, right? Between producers, a lot of dispute over fields and that sort of thing. And I asked him, I said, well, can you, when I sink a well and put it in place, can it stay there, and you don't have to use it? And he said, yeah. I said, is there any time limit on it? I said, as far as I know, because they're in oil production, right? When the price of oil went way down in the early 80s, they had to start shutting in a lot of wells because just to keep them active, they weren't worth anything. But my understanding, and I just asked him, he said, as far as he knows, you can put in sink in a gas well, and then mine it later, right? Mine it later, and so putting the production in place, you're really looking at, it's almost like in-the-ground storage for future market. So I still may want to go drill and put it in place right now. Just to hold it.
Yeah. The natural gas projections of the early 21st century did not anticipate the technological developments, even though they were well underway. What lessons can we learn from this myopia and failure of prediction?
So you should never ask an economist about predictions.
Do you have a model? Did you bring a model with you here? And then the last question, can you talk about any decision modeling analyses you've done on this topic?
I'm going to go back to that just for a second. Sure. So one of the things that strikes me about this is, do you know about the bet between Julian Simon and Paul Ehrlich?
I'm just writing a blurb for a book on that.
Yeah, and so the thing, Simon was such a curmudgeon, and here he is right again. Okay, if you think about what's happened with I think about peak oil.
Actually, you should describe the bet.
So the bet was Simon said to pick any commodity you want, right? Pick any commodity you want, and I'll bet you that its real price will go down over time, right? And in his point, the thing that he was saying is that technology and innovation is going to make the price of that commodity go down. And here he is. I mean, he's dead now. Right, but from the grave, he's right again. If you think about just 5 years ago, people were talking a lot about peak oil, and here it is, technology again has come in, and I don't know that it's forever going to do that. And in some way, you'd like us to have to like man up and really face that there's scarcity in the world. But in this case, technology is for the remainder of our lives, right? For everybody in this room, this has really transformed the energy picture, and it's all technologically based.
I am writing a blurb for a book by Paul Sabin. Just a second, just one moment. Oh, sorry, what?
Good.
Just read about Ray Kurzweil. He
Okay.
heads up Google right now, engineering. Read what he has to say, blow your mind.
Okay, and meanwhile, I'm going to do my blurb for Paul Sabin's new book called The Bet, which is on
Oh.
Jillian Simon and Paul Ehrlich, and is not released, but you'll find my blurb on the book jacket for that. But it's a wonderful exploration of that bet and that effort to predict the future, and Paul Ehrlich's frustrations over that. So, and Paul Sabin is a great writer, so get that book. Can you talk about any decision modeling analyses you've made on this topic, or think about making on the topic of natural gas and its production and decisions we make about it?
I haven't done any research of this area. She just asked me to come because I'm an economist. One of the things I was thinking about, though, earlier today, I went and took a run mid-afternoon knowing that I was going to come up here and work late. And one of the things I was thinking about is there's some, so to me, I think about the scale. If we were to draw out drilling production, right? If we were to draw out drilling production and put it in 3D, right? In 3D, is there some rule, right? Is there some law of screw up, right? That's associated with it? Because I think about, nothing. Deepwater Horizon was unprecedented, right? It was unprecedented. And I started thinking about, and the reason that was so problematic is because it was so deep. And it's not even among the deepest offshore, operations in the world. And I was thinking, well, if you think about, drilling down a mile versus drilling down 500 feet, is there some exponential law of screw up? So I was thinking, I should research that. Maybe I could have some law named after me.
Well, and I'm sorry to cut you off, sir. That sounded like an interesting point there. But, ladies and gentlemen, don't thank me. Thank you
Thank
you for coming up and
That was fun.
it's fun. It's a good group.